October 19, 2007, 2:15 p.m., Fort Hunt, Virginia. Inside a sterile, modern conference room built over soil that held secrets for 62 years, National Park Service historian Matthew Reeves adjusted a small digital recorder. Former interrogator Henry Colm, then a frail 85-year-old, leaned into the microphone, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust from unearthed archives. His voice, thin but steady, delivered the first public crack in a wall of secrecy built in 1942. "We heard everything," he confessed, his words cutting through the room's quiet hum. "We knew what they dreamed about at night. The real interrogation happened when they thought they were alone." That quiet confession was the final key, unlocking a story that began in the darkest days of 1942. The Battle of the Atlantic was a maelstrom of fire and freezing water, a brutal calculus of loss. Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat wolf packs were gutting the Allied lifeline. In November 1942 alone, a staggering 118 ships, totaling 700 gross tons, were sent to the bottom of the ocean. The pressure from commanders like Admiral Ernest King, the formidable U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, was immense. He demanded intelligence from Brigadier General John Weckerling and the Military Intelligence Service, anything to gain an edge against the new G7S Zaunkönig acoustic torpedoes. The corridors of the War Department in Washington, D.C., stank of stale cigar smoke and desperation, as strategists stared at maps covered in red pins, each one representing thousands of tons of lost steel and hundreds of drowned men. They needed a miracle, and they were willing to build it in secret. On August 15, 1942, that miracle was given a mailing address, P.O. Box 1142. On a secluded 167-acre plot of land at Fort Hunt, Virginia, just 15 miles from the White House, a revolutionary intelligence operation came to life under the command of Colonel Daniel W. Kent, a stern career officer from the Command and General Staff School. The program's architect was Captain John Kluge, a German immigrant born in Chemnitz in 1914, who had earned his economics degree from Columbia in 1937. Kluge, a man whose crisp uniform never seemed to wrinkle despite the oppressive Virginia humidity, possessed a preternatural understanding of the German psyche. He wasn't a brute. He was a psychological surgeon, tasked with dissecting the minds of Germany's most elite soldiers within innocuous-looking wooden barracks hidden behind a double cyclone fence, a place designed to be utterly forgettable. The secret wasn't a bomb or a code. It was a cage built of comfort. While other camps adhered to the Spartan rules of the Geneva Convention, Kluge's Fort Hunt method, weaponized kindness. High-value Nazi prisoners, U-boat aces, and Luftwaffe pilots were given steak, ice cream, and access to a 9,000-volume library. The true weapon, however, hummed silently beneath their feet. In the basement of the Post Exchange, technicians from the 60th Signal Service Company monitored over 120 hidden RCA Model 77D microphones, recording every whispered conversation onto Brush Development Company Model BK 401 wire recorders. Their spools of 0.0036-inch steel wire capturing the secrets the Reich was desperate to protect. Before I tell you how Captain John Kluge and his hand-picked team of specialists, including Jewish refugee Master Sergeant George Frenkel and MIT-trained engineer Major Carl F. Timms, managed to use this unprecedented system of surveillance and kindness to turn hardened Nazi POWs into the Allies' most valuable intelligence assets. Comment below where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of P.O. Box 1142, the Canary cage that systematically dismantled the secrets of the Third Reich, one friendly conversation at a time. The winter of 1942 was the season of the wolf. In the frigid gray expanse of the North Atlantic, Admiral Karl Donitz, the stoic commander of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm, was winning his tonnage war. His wolf packs, numbering over 200 operational Type 7 and Type 9 submarines, tore the heart out of Allied convoys. By October 29, 1942, the monthly losses had surpassed 650,000 tons. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King, a man whose severity was legendary, felt the cold dread creep into the War Department's corridors, a feeling as palpable as the ever-present scent of stale coffee and dread. The German tactics were brutally effective, a symphony of stealth and coordinated violence. U-boat commanders like Korvettenkapitän Peter Erich Kremer of U-333 would shadow a convoy for days, surfacing only at night to use their superior 17-knot surface speed. Communicating via short encrypted bursts from their Lorenz 1-kilowatt Kurzwellensender transmitters, they would assemble a wolf pack of 8 to 15 boats. Then, on a moonless night, they would strike from inside the convoy's defensive screen. The sound that haunted Allied sailors wasn't the explosion, but the terrifyingly quiet hiss of a G-7E electric torpedo slicing through the water at 30 knots, a sound that preceded annihilation by mere seconds, a whisper before the roar. The strategy, refined since 1940, was reaching its terrifying peak. This deadly efficiency was underpinned by a technological advantage that had left Allied intelligence staggering in the dark. On February 1, 1942, Donitz's command switched the U-boat fleet to the new four-rotor M4 Enigma cipher machine, adding an astronomical layer of complexity that instantly blinded the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. Hut 8, under the brilliant but strained command of Alan Turing, fell silent. The daily U-boat positions vanished from the Admiralty's maps. This Enigma blackout lasted for over 10 agonizing months. Compounding the problem was the German Mitox R600 radar detector, a simple wooden-framed antenna that gave U-boat crews a crucial 20-minute warning of approaching Allied aircraft using the outdated ASV Mark II radar, allowing them to dive to a safe depth of 120 meters long before they could be spotted. The air in Bletchley stank of frustration and the ozone tang of overworked bomb machines. The human cost was a litany of horrors whispered in survivor reports and censored letters home. For the men of the Merchant Marine, the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't a strategic map. It was a constant, visceral terror. On November 2, 1942, the freighter times SS Hahira was torpedoed 400 miles off the coast of Iceland. The explosion of 300 kilograms of hexanite tore the ship in half in less than 60 seconds. Men were pitched into the -1 degree Celsius water, the thermal shock stealing their breath. The sea, choked with thick black bunker oil, burned around them. The average survival time was under 10 minutes. This scene, witnessed by men like Chief Mate Horace Carswell, repeated itself over 100 times that month alone. Back in Washington, the pressure was volcanic. The responsibility for finding an answer, any answer, fell squarely on the shoulders of men like Brigadier General John Weckerling, head of the Military Intelligence Service. Weckerling, a career officer who had served in the Philippines since 1920, was a pragmatist who trusted process over genius. His daily 0800 briefing with General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, had become a grim ritual of reporting catastrophic losses. By late summer 1942, Marshall and Admiral King made it clear conventional intelligence wasn't working. They needed something new, something that went beyond cracking codes that were no longer breakable. This is where the strange alchemy of command began, pairing men who couldn't be more different for a single desperate purpose. The operational command of P.O. Box 1142 fell to Colonel Daniel W. Kent, a 1918 graduate of the Command and General Staff School, a man who believed in discipline, order, and the unassailable logic of military hierarchy. He was all sharp angles and polished brass, a man whose office at Fort Hunt smelled of saddle soap and authority. Into this rigid world stepped Captain John Kluge, the German-born Columbia graduate. Kluge, always in a perfectly pressed uniform despite the Virginia humidity, was a student of the mind. Where Kent saw prisoners as military assets to be processed, Kluge saw them as complex psychological mechanisms to be understood and, if possible, carefully disassembled. Their initial planning meetings between July and August 1942 were a study in contrasts, the gruff soldier and the quiet intellectual, forging the foundations of a new kind of war. They were fighting an enemy of formidable will and indoctrination. The typical U-boat crewman was between 19 and 25 years old, a product of the Hitler Youth, and fanatically loyal to commanders like Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan of U-123. They endured unimaginable conditions inside their 67-meter-long Type 7C submarines, crammed among 43 other men for patrols that could last 8 weeks. The air inside the boat was a foul cocktail of diesel fumes, sweat, and rotting food. Yet, their morale in 1942 was sky high. Fed a diet of propaganda from Joseph Goebbels and reports of mounting Allied losses, they believed they were invincible, the iron fist of the Reich. This was the mindset Kluge and his team had to crack. The most terrifying rumor galvanizing the Allied command in late 1942 was of a new wonder weapon for the U-boats, an acoustic torpedo. Intelligence reports, pieced together from radio intercepts and whispers from agents in neutral ports, spoke of a torpedo that could steer itself by listening for a ship's propellers. This weapon, the G7 as Zaunkönig, or Wren, threatened to make convoy escort a suicidal duty. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, under the direction of Rear Admiral William H.P. Blandy, had no countermeasure and no concrete data. The project, initiated at Germany's Torpedoversuchsanstalt Eckernford in 1938, was a complete black box, and finding its secrets became one of P.O. Box 1142's highest priorities. To unravel these secrets, Kluge assembled a team of specialists whose backgrounds were as unconventional as the mission itself. His most crucial asset was Master Sergeant George Frenkel, a Jewish refugee who had fled Berlin in 1937 after earning a philosophy degree. Frenkel was a quiet, almost wraith-like man, with deep-set, sorrowful eyes, yet he possessed an uncanny ability to build rapport. His entire family had been murdered by the Gestapo, a fact confirmed in a Red Cross letter dated May 12, 1942. This personal tragedy fueled a cold, precise determination. He would spend nights poring over prisoner dossiers, cross-referencing them with pre-war German academic journals from the camp's 9,000-volume library. Then there was Major Carl F. Timms of the Signal Corps, the MIT-trained engineer. A man of few words with perpetually ink-stained fingers, Timms was the technical genius who saw the mission as an engineering problem. How to capture a clear whisper at 15 feet through 2 layers of pine board, using a modified RCA-77D microphone without the target ever knowing. The need for this new approach was underscored by the abject failure of existing interrogation methods. At standard POW camps across the United States, from Camp Forrest in Tennessee to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, interrogations were largely fruitless. The procedures, dictated by the Provost Marshal General's Office and adhering strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention, yielded little more than name, rank, and serial number. Reports filed in September and October 1942 detailed how seasoned U-boat officers and Luftwaffe pilots, schooled by the Abwehr on counter-interrogation techniques, would simply refuse to speak or would actively feed misinformation. Their ideological armor, forged in years of Nazi propaganda, was proving impervious to threats and deprivation. The strategic clock was ticking with terrifying speed. December 7, 1942, marked the first anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and while the Pacific War was turning at Guadalcanal, the Atlantic was on the verge of being lost. The success of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, which had begun on November 8, 1942, depended entirely on a fragile supply line of over 3,000 miles of open ocean. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, from his headquarters in Gibraltar, sent no fewer than 12 urgent cables to Washington between November 10th and November 30th, warning that U-boat interdiction was threatening to cripple his entire campaign before it could truly begin. The world these prisoners came from was one of concrete and steel, a fortress built to dominate the sea. The U-boat pens at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire in occupied France were monstrous testaments to Nazi engineering. Designed by the Tot organization beginning in February 1941, these structures were gargantuan, with reinforced concrete roofs up to 7 meters thick, capable of withstanding any Allied bomb. Inside, the air was a cacophony of shrieking grinders, hammering steel, and the guttural shouts of work crews. U-boats, like U-48, commanded by the ace Herbert Schulze, would return from patrols to be repaired and rearmed in these impregnable caverns. This brutalist industrial world bred a sense of invulnerability in the men, a feeling that P.O. Box 1142 was designed to systematically dismantle, with quiet, carpeted rooms and the unheard-of luxury of a well-cooked meal. The Allied forces at sea were scrambling to adapt, forming the first rudimentary hunter-killer groups. Task forces were built around new escort carriers like the U.S. Card and U.S. Bogue, each carrying around 12 Grumman TB-F Avenger torpedo bombers and 9 F-4F Wildcat fighters. These groups, under the command of pioneers like Captain Arnold J. Isbell, were a desperate improvisation. Their pilots, flying in the notoriously foul weather of the North Atlantic, were often guided by unreliable HFDF, high-frequency direction-finding intercepts, and primitive shipborne Type SG radar systems, which had a maximum detection range of only 15 nautical miles. They were fighting a technologically superior foe with courage and little else. The psychological toll on the Allied High Command was immense. In a tense meeting of the Anti-U-Boat Warfare Committee in London on November 19, 1942, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was presented with the latest loss figures, over 700,000 tons that month. Sir Dudley Pound, the exhausted First Sea Lord, pointed out that for every 2 new ships launched from American yards, nearly 3 were being sunk. The tonnage war was a simple, horrifying math problem they were failing to solve. The entire Allied strategy, from Lend-Lease to the eventual cross-channel invasion, rested on winning this battle. It was this very desperation, this recognition that the technological and tactical battle was being lost, that gave birth to the psychological front. A top-secret memorandum, stamped with the Trident classification and signed by General George C. Marshall on July 20, 1942, authorized the Military Intelligence Service to establish an, quote, experimental facility for special interrogation. The document, known only to a handful of men on the bigot list, allocated $125,000 and gave Colonel Kent carte blanche to build his team. It was a formal admission that the key to defeating Germany's most advanced weapons might not lie in a laboratory, but in the unguarded conversations of the men who operated them. P.O. Box 1142 wasn't just a camp, it was the ultimate flanking maneuver, an attack on the enemy's mind. The physical birth of P.O. Box 1142 was a frantic, controlled storm of construction throughout the humid summer of 1942. Under the watchful eye of Colonel Daniel W. Kent, civilian Conservation Corps barracks were gutted and rebuilt with astonishing speed. The air, thick with the scent of freshly cut Virginia pine and wet paint, buzzed with the work of Army engineers and the 60th Signal Service Company. They weren't just building a camp, they were meticulously crafting a massive listening device. Major Carl F. Timms, his MIT engineering ring glinting in the sun, arrived on July 22, 1942, with a set of blueprints stamped Trident, and the true secret work began. Major Timms, a man who preferred the clean logic of schematics to the messiness of conversation, was the project's technical heart. He was given a budget of $75,000 for the initial electronic setup, a line item authorized directly by Brigadier General John Weckerling. Timms's fingers, perpetually smudged with graphite, would trace the plans for hours in his makeshift office, the constant hum of a newly installed 50-kilowatt generator vibrating through the floor. The core of his system was a network of over 120 RCA Model 77D ribbon microphones, chosen for their unparalleled sensitivity across the 50 to 15,000 Hz frequency range. These signals would be piped to a bank of Brush Development Company Model BK401 wire recorders in a shielded basement, each machine painstakingly calibrated to capture whispers on a 0.0036-inch steel wire spool that could hold 66 minutes of conversation. The installation was a masterwork of clandestine engineering, executed with military precision between July 25 and August 14, 1942. Major Timms and his lead NCO, Master Sergeant Leo Pasternak, a former Bell Labs technician, drove their 15-man team through grueling 18-hour shifts. They ran over 5 miles of shielded coaxial cable beneath the floorboards of Building B1 and the creamery, the main interrogation house. The air in these buildings was a sensory assault, the sharp, acrid smell of soldering flux, mixed with stale sweat, and the incessant whine of electric drills. Microphones were concealed with obsessive care. Some peered through pinholes drilled in wooden wall panels, others were nestled inside bakelite light fixtures, and 2 were even embedded within the hollow steel headboards of the beds. Colonel Daniel W. Kent, his boots echoing on the newly laid linoleum, conducted a final inspection at 1,700 hours on August 14, running his white-gloved finger along a wall, searching for any sign of the 12 hidden microphones within it. He found none. While Major Timms wired the physical cage, Captain John Kluge, a man whose crisp uniform seemed to repel the oppressive Virginia humidity, was busy designing its psychological architecture. He didn't requisition barbed wire. He requisitioned knowledge. In a series of trips to the Library of Congress in late July 1942, Kluge, accompanied by 2 armed guards from the Military Intelligence Service, personally selected over 9,000 volumes. His choices were surgically precise, ranging from the complete works of Goethe and Schiller to highly specific technical manuals, like the 1941 edition of the Kriegsmarine Dieselmotoren Handbook. Kluge, a Columbia economics graduate who understood the German obsession with intellectualism, knew these books weren't for leisure. They were bait, carefully chosen to spark conversations about engineering, philosophy, and home, conversations that would be captured on spools of steel wire. The human machinery of the operation was assembled with equal care. In the first week of August 1942, Captain Kluge and Master Sergeant George Frankel locked themselves in a secure office at the War Department, surrounded by stacks of POW dossiers from the Office of Naval Intelligence. The room smelled of stale paper and strong coffee as they worked for 3 straight days. Frankel, the quiet Jewish refugee from Berlin, whose entire family had been consumed by the Nazi machine, possessed a chillingly precise eye for psychological fracture. He wasn't looking for traitors. He was looking for disillusioned patriots, men whose capture had shattered their ideological armor. By August 10th, they had a list of 12 potential stool pigeons, men from U-boats and downed Messerschmitts, who would become the first unwitting cogs in Kluge's intelligence engine. Deep beneath the camp's post-exchange, in a windowless, soundproofed room always kept at a brisk 65 degrees Fahrenheit, Major Timms's creation came to life. This was the nerve center, smelling of ozone and hot vacuum tubes. Here, 24 hours a day, technicians from the 60th Signal Service Company sat before banks of 12 Brush BK401 recorders. Men like Corporal Alan Brody, a German-speaking immigrant from Queens, would spend their 8-hour shifts with heavy headphones clamped on, listening. The only sounds were the soft whir of the wire spools and the scratching of their pencils as they transcribed overheard whispers onto classified logs, each entry marked with the time, date, and prisoner number. The Fort Hunt method was a symphony of technology and psychology, codified by Kluge and Timms in a 50-page operational manual by August 12, 1942. A new high-value target, like the captured U-boat watch officer Oberleutnant zur See Hans Joachim Decker, would be placed in a prepared room in Building B1 with a vetted stool pigeon. For 48 hours they would be left entirely alone, supplied with good food, books, and cigarettes. The technicians below would capture everything. A 2:30 a.m. conversation about the poor performance of the new Metox R600 radar detector, a casual complaint about its 20-minute warning time being insufficient against aircraft using the new 10-centimeter radar, would be transcribed, analyzed by Kluge, and on the desk of an O&I analyst by 9 o'clock. The cost of the 2 wire spools needed to capture this was $8. The intelligence was priceless. The security protocols, designed by Colonel Kent himself, were brutally effective. Compartmentalization was the ruling principle. Of the nearly 200 personnel at Fort Hunt, only the 300 individuals on the bigot list, the interrogators, analysts, and wiretap technicians, knew the facility's true purpose. The 800-plus guards, cooks, and administrative staff were fed a cover story that P.O. Box 1142 was a high-security holding facility for captured spies and saboteurs awaiting trial. This meant Corporal Samuel Haas, transcribing a U-boat captain's nightmare in the PX basement, would never meet the man whose subconscious he was mining, a deliberate separation of functions that made a catastrophic security breach virtually impossible. On August 15, 1942, at exactly 0800 hours, the system went live. The first subject was Hauptmann Erich Braun, a decorated Luftwaffe bomber pilot whose Junkers Ju-88 was shot down over the English coast on August 2. He was led to a clean, simple room in Building B1, offered a steak dinner, and given a 1939 German edition of * All Quiet on the Western Front. He didn't know that Major Carl Timms had personally tested the RCA-77D microphone hidden behind the room's heating grate just 24 hours earlier, confirming it could clearly pick up the sound of a match being struck from 15 feet away. The Canary cage was finally ready for its first songbird. The entire operation was a calculated assault on the Nazi psyche, an environment engineered by Captain John Kluge to systematically erode a soldier's identity. The provision of amenities wasn't kindness for kindness's sake. It was a psychological weapon. Prisoners were shown Hollywood films starring Marlene Dietrich, a German starlet reviled by the Reich, twice a week in the camp theater. They were given American baseball gloves and taught the rules of the game by guards who knew nothing of the real mission. This constant exposure to decadent American culture, combined with the absence of the harsh discipline they were used to, created a profound sense of disorientation. As Kluge theorized in a memo to Colonel Kent dated August 1, 1942, the goal was to, quote, substitute the authority of the Führer with the authority of the camp commander, and to make that authority benevolent. It was a war for the mind, and P.O. Box 1142 was its most secret and most sophisticated battlefield. Across the Atlantic, in a smoke-filled office on Berlin's Tirpitzofer, the Abwehr was flying blind. Oberst Wilhelm Kriegbaum, deputy head of military intelligence, reviewed a stack of reports on February 15, 1943. Allied anti-submarine warfare success had jumped by 22% in 90 days, a statistical impossibility without a major intelligence breach. Yet, reports from neutral Switzerland and captured Allied airmen spoke of no harsh interrogation methods. The Americans were supposedly soft. Kriegbaum, a man who believed only in pressure and pain, couldn't square the circle. The enemy was winning, but their methods remained an infuriating, placid mystery. This ignorance was carefully cultivated. When Dr. Marcel Junod of the International Red Cross arrived for a scheduled inspection on March 10, 1943, Colonel Daniel W. Kent orchestrated a masterful piece of theater. Dr. Junod was given a guided tour of Camp No. 3, a Potemkin village section of Fort Hunt, where 25 prisoners, specially selected for their non-essential status, recited memorized lines about fair treatment. The real workhorse, Building B1, was conspicuously cordoned off with large signs declaring a typhoid quarantine, the air thick, with the sharp clinical smell of carbolic acid, a scent powerful enough to deter even the most curious inspector. Dr. Junod's final report, filed on March 25, 1943, praised the U.S. Army for its humane conditions, noting only the unfortunate but necessary quarantine of one barracks building. To the German High Command, the entire concept of P.O. Box 1142 was psychologically inconceivable. For men like Gross Admiral Karl Donitz, whose entire command philosophy was built on iron will and Spartan sacrifice, the idea that his U-boat aces could be defeated by steak and ice cream was absurd. The Nazi ideology, which viewed American culture as a decadent, weak-willed mess, simply couldn't process it. An Abwehr analysis dated May 5, 1943, compiled from censored prisoner mail that had all passed through Fort Hunt's post office, concluded that American interrogation was, quote, amateurish and inefficient. They were looking for evidence of brutality, for the signature of the Gestapo. Finding none, they concluded there was nothing to find, that the rising Allied success must be a purely technological advantage, a fatal miscalculation that would cost them the Battle of the Atlantic. Out in the cold, black water, the consequences of this miscalculation were brutally real. On the night of April 17, 1943, Capitan Lieutenant Horst Kessler of U-128 found his attack on convoy HX-233 turning into a perfectly laid trap. A hunter-killer group led by the escort carrier USS Bogue seemed to anticipate his every move. They weren't just in the right area. They knew his Wolfpack's exact vector and the standard 7-meter depth setting for their G7A torpedoes. The sound of the first pattern of 600-pound depth charges exploding wasn't a distant thump. It was a deafening roar that buckled the U-boat's pressure hull, a sound far too close for coincidence. The source of that deadly precision was a quiet conversation whispered 2 weeks earlier. At 0200 hours on April 2, 1943, Master Sergeant George Frankel, his gaunt face a mask of concentration under a single desk lamp, was analyzing a transcript. Oberleutnant Zur C. Klaus Richter, a captured officer from U-603, had been complaining to his stool pigeon bunkmate about the predictability of attack patterns dictated by Donitz's command. He specifically mentioned the standard 7-meter depth setting and the use of the Kurd signal heft 1941 for coded messages. Frankel, a man whose entire family had been erased by the Reich, felt no triumph, only a cold, methodical focus, as his pen underlined the key phrases. That transcript was on Captain Kluge's desk by 0600. From there, the intelligence moved with terrifying speed. Captain John Kluge, after meticulously cleaning his wire-rimmed spectacles, a ritual he performed before any critical decision, cross-referenced Richter's intel with 2 other transcripts from captured U-boat radiomen. By 1100 hours, the verified intelligence was encrypted on a SIG-ABA machine and transmitted to Admiral Francis S. Lowe, Chief of Staff for the U.S. 10th Fleet, the nerve center of the Atlantic War. On April 5, 1943, a new directive, ASW Tactical Bulletin 4-43, was issued to all hunter-killer groups. It advised setting depth charge patterns for a 7-meter detonation and provided a list of likely radio frequencies for U-boat coordination. The entire Allied fleet adapted its tactics, all because a 22-year-old German officer felt safe enough to complain in a quiet room in Virginia, never suspecting Major Carl Tims's RCA-77D microphone was silently listening from behind the wall grate. The German Air Force was just as baffled. On June 20, 1943, Major Hannes Trautloft, the celebrated leader of Jagdgeschwader 54 on the Eastern Front, was debriefed after a tour of the Channel defenses. He was livid. His new Focke-Wulf FW-190s, the pride of the Luftwaffe, were being systematically torn apart by American P-47 Thunderbolts. The American pilots fought with an uncanny prescience, seeming to know the FW-190's precise operational ceiling of 11,000 meters, and, more critically, the exact 10-minute limit of its MW-50 methanol water injection system, attacking the moment the German planes lost their power boost. Once again, the answer was found not in a wrecked engine but in a conversation. On May 15, 1943, Captain Kluge sat down for a friendly chat with captured Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a decorated Bf-109 ace. Instead of asking about tactics, Kluge, using his Columbia economics degree, steered the conversation to German industrial capacity. Flattered, and enjoying a rare Cuban cigar provided by Kluge, Stigler spoke freely about production bottlenecks, specifically complaining that the MW-50 boost system was so resource-intensive they could only produce enough for a 10-minute combat window. The rich, sweet smell of cigar smoke filled the interrogation room, as Kluge nodded sympathetically, committing every number to memory. The cumulative effect of these invisible leaks began to show at the highest levels. During a tense strategy conference at the Wolf's Lair on July 1, 1943, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel presented a grim report to Hitler. U-boat losses had spiked by another 15% in the last 90 days, and the Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots at an unsustainable rate. The official explanation was suspected Allied technological breakthroughs in radar and aircraft performance. No one in the room, surrounded by maps of their shrinking empire, even considered the possibility that the leak was human, flowing from a place they didn't know existed. This utter ignorance was guaranteed by the ironclad security protocols designed by Colonel Daniel W. Kent, a man who believed secrecy was a structural element, not a policy. His most important rule was absolute: no return. No high-value prisoner who passed through the full program at P.O. Box 1142 was ever exchanged or repatriated until after Germany's final surrender in May 1945. This severed any possible intelligence feedback loop. Furthermore, the 800-man support staff was rotated every 90 days, preventing any one person from observing the camp's true rhythm. A guard like Private First Class Robert Miller, walking his 2.5-mile perimeter beat, smelled the occasional steak cooking but dismissed it as officers' privilege, the daily scent of boiling cabbage from the main mess hall, a far more believable reality of Army life. The enemy's technical experts were equally lost. At the BDU communications bunker in Kurnevel, John's forgotten Kapitän Eberhard Gott, Donitz's stoic chief of operations, spent weeks analyzing Allied naval traffic. Their own code breakers, the B-Dienst, could read large portions of the Allied convoy ciphers, but the messages showed no prior knowledge of U-boat locations. Gott and his top analyst, Captain Heinz Bonatz, concluded in a report dated August 11, 1943, that the Allies must have perfected a new 10-centimeter airborne radar capable of detecting a periscope at over 5 miles. They doubled down on technological solutions, never imagining the real source was a 19-year-old radio operator from U-175 talking in his sleep about frequency-hopping schedules to a bunkmate who was writing it all down. Nowhere was this confusion more apparent than with the debut of the G7's Zonkönig acoustic torpedo in September 1943. The weapon was supposed to revolutionize naval warfare, a guaranteed ship killer. Yet, in its first major deployment against convoy ONS-18, Allied escorts immediately began towing a strange new device that made a loud clanking noise. The Zonkönigs, drawn to the louder sound, detonated harmlessly 200 meters behind their targets. U-boat commanders were stunned. How had the Allies developed a perfect, custom-built countermeasure for a top-secret weapon within weeks of its deployment? The answer was buried in over 200 pages of transcripts from Fort Hunt's basement. On July 22, 1943, 2 captured engineers from Germany's Torpedo research facility, Dr. Hans Kepler and Jürgen Brandt, were placed in a bugged room in Building B1. Believing themselves to be in a standard holding camp, they spent 2 days arguing furiously over the Zonkenig's design flaws. They discussed its precise acoustic guidance frequency of 24.5 kHz and its primitive logic, which couldn't distinguish between the complex sound of a ship's propellers and a simpler, louder noise source. Major Carl Timms, reviewing the recording quality from his soundproof booth, could clearly hear the clink of their coffee cups as they sealed the fate of Germany's wonder weapon. The transcript was on a desk at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory by July 25. The Foxer acoustic decoy was the result. By early 1944, this string of inexplicable Allied successes had shattered the morale of Germany's elite forces. A deep, corrosive fatalism began to replace the arrogant confidence of 1942. Letters home from U-boat crews, intercepted and analyzed by Allied censors, spoke of an Allied ghost, an unseen, all-knowing presence that haunted the Atlantic. Oberleutnant zur See Werner Hardenstein of U-156, a decorated ace, wrote to his wife on February 8, 1944, just before his final patrol, "It is as if they hear our thoughts before we have them. We sail into a sea of ghosts." This psychological defeat, born in the quiet, comfortable rooms of P.O. Box 1142, was as devastating as any depth charge. The final, crushing proof of the enemy's ignorance came after the war itself, when Allied intelligence teams from Operation TICOM interrogated the captured leadership of the Abwehr and Gestapo, including the infamous Walter Schellenberg. They asked them about American interrogation techniques. The German intelligence chiefs described what they had always assumed was happening: brutal camps, physical torture, and starvation. They had extensive files on British interrogation centers, but not a single document, not one rumor, mentioned a place called Fort Hunt or its mailing address, P.O. Box 1142. The secret of the Canary cage had been kept perfectly. By the dawn of 1944, P.O. Box 1142 was no longer an experiment. It was a finely tuned factory for secrets. The system, once a desperate improvisation, now operated with the cold, predictable efficiency of an assembly line. Under the ever-watchful eye of Captain John Kluge, the process had been honed to a science. The arrival of a new high-value prisoner, like Luftwaffe ace, Oberst Werner Mulders as adjutant, on January 5, 1944, triggered a 72-hour protocol that was as unvarying as it was effective. The scent of dread and desperation from 1942 had been replaced by the quiet hum of a machine that knew it was winning. The technology evolved in lockstep with the methods. Major Carl F. Timms, a man who found more comfort in the logic of circuits than the company of men, had secured a new budget of $50,000 from Brigadier General John Weckerling on December 15, 1943. Working with his new NCO, Sergeant Bill Connolly, Timms oversaw the installation of 20 new listening stations in the basement of the post exchange. The old Brush BK 401 wire recorders were supplemented with experimental Ampex Model 200 magnetic tape recorders, which offered a superior 90-minute recording time and a signal-to-noise ratio of over 60 decibels. The low, constant hum of the new power inverters became the camp's secret heartbeat, a sound no prisoner ever heard, but one that dictated their fate. Captain John Kluge's psychological toolkit became vastly more sophisticated and personal throughout 1943, moving beyond simple comforts. By February 10, 1944, he had instituted a new protocol based on deep dossier analysis, conducted by Master Sergeant George Frenkel. For a captured U-boat engineer from Hamburg, this meant a phonograph in his room playing the music of Johannes Brahms and a 2-week-old copy of the Hamburger Fremdenblatt left on his nightstand. These intensely personal touches, curated by Frenkel from a library of over 500 regional German newspapers, were designed to evoke a powerful sense of Heimweh a deep, painful homesickness. This manufactured nostalgia, combined with the carefully selected conversation prompts from a stool pigeon, proved to be a psychological lockpick for which the Abwehr had no countermeasure, consistently reducing the time to first significant intelligence disclosure by an average of 48 hours. The intelligence harvested wasn't just tactical, it was becoming strategically decisive. In the critical months leading up to D-Day, this was never clearer. On April 12, 1944, a captured Oberleutnant from Erwin Rommel's staff, Franz Gockel, was brought to Fort Hunt. During a seemingly innocuous conversation about coastal engineering with a friendly interrogator, Lieutenant Peter Weiss, Gockel bitterly complained about the poor quality of the concrete being used for the new beach fortifications at a sector codenamed Widerstandsnest 62 inches, a sector that would later be known to the world as Omaha Beach. He mentioned that only 4 of the planned 12 anti-tank gun emplacements were properly reinforced. This single piece of intelligence, transmitted to SHAEF headquarters on April 15, directly influenced the pre-invasion naval bombardment plans, a small detail that would save the lives of hundreds of men from the 1st Infantry Division. As the stakes grew higher, Colonel Daniel W. Kent's obsession with security intensified, becoming a near-paranoid art form. On March 1, 1944, he implemented a third layer of internal security checks, creating a new blue list of 25 personnel with access to raw, unanalyzed transcripts. These men, mostly German-speaking linguists like Corporal Alan Brody, were now rotated to non-sensitive duties every 60 days instead of 90, preventing any single individual from assembling too large a piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's Abwehr was still chasing ghosts. A detailed report dated May 20, 1944, concluded that the Allies' uncanny success must stem from a new form of infrared detection, and they wasted over 2 million Reichsmarks developing a useless U-boat coating called Alberic, a testament to their complete and utter ignorance of the real threat. The single greatest intelligence prize of the Atlantic War fell into their laps on June 4, 1944. Task Group 22.3, commanded by the audacious Captain Daniel V. Gallery, captured U-505 intact off the coast of West Africa. Instead of being sent to a regular POW camp, the entire 59-man crew, including its commander Oberleutnant Harold Long, was secretly diverted to P.O. Box 1142. They arrived under the cover of darkness on June 19, their arrival masked by a staged convoy of supply trucks. For Captain Kluge and his team, this wasn't a trickle of information. It was a tidal wave. Over the next 90 days, the crew yielded not only the complete Enigma M4 machine and codebooks for June, but also detailed schematics for the T5 Konig Torpedo's guidance system and the operational patrol grids for the entire North Atlantic Fleet for the next 3 months. The air in the transcription basement was electric, thick with the smell of coffee and the clatter of a dozen typewriters working around the clock. The results of this coup were brutally statistically quantifiable. The intelligence from the U-505 crew alone allowed Allied hunter-killer groups to preemptively clear U-boat killing zones before convoys even entered them. An after-action report filed by Admiral Ernest King's staff on October 1, 1944, directly credited the Fort Hunt debriefings with saving an estimated 70 Allied warships and the lives of at least 15,000 sailors between July and September 1944. The cost of operating P.O. Box 1142 for that entire period was less than $100,000. The value of the 3.5 million tons of war material that reached Britain unimpeded was, by any measure, incalculable. The system's impact reached far beyond the gray waves of the Atlantic, stretching back in time to influence the air war over Germany. The quiet interrogation of captured General der Artillerie Wilhelm von Thoma on November 4, 1942, had yielded the first solid confirmation of the V-1 and V-2 rocket programs at Peenemünde. This initial report was corroborated and expanded upon by 2 captured scientists from the facility in May 1943. This cumulative intelligence collated by a special MIS team under Lieutenant Colonel Richard D. Tyndall, was the primary catalyst for the RAF's massive bombing raid, Operation Hydra, on the night of August 17, 1943. The attack by 596 heavy bombers, while costly, set back the V-2 program by a critical 6 months, a delay that prevented Hitler from unleashing his vengeance weapon on London until after the successful Normandy landings. The scent of high explosives that night on the Baltic coast was a direct consequence of a few quiet conversations held 4,000 miles away in a Virginia farmhouse. The secret itself seemed to take on a life of its own, becoming an invisible, growing entity within the Allied war machine. By late 1944, the program's data had become so vast that Master Sergeant George Frenkel, working with 2 statisticians from the War Department, had created a library of over 2,000 detailed psychological profiles. They could cross-reference a prisoner's hometown, education, and service branch to predict with an astonishing 85% accuracy which psychological approach would be most effective and the likely time, down to a 24-hour window to first intelligence disclosure. Captain Kluge's team, including interrogators like Lieutenant Henry Colm, was no longer just reacting to captured assets. They were proactively shaping the intelligence landscape, a process that saved the Allies an estimated 300 operational days and millions of dollars in redundant intelligence-gathering efforts. As the war ground towards its inevitable conclusion in the bitter winter of 1945, the Canary cage was operating at its absolute peak efficiency, a silent, relentless engine of truth. The system had become the Allies' most potent and most closely guarded weapon. It wasn't forged from steel or packed with explosives, but built from comfort, empathy, and the ceaseless, whispering hum of 0.0036-inch steel wire spinning in a quiet basement. It was the sound of an empire's deepest secrets being unraveled, one defeated, homesick whisper at a time. For over 60 years, the ground at Fort Hunt held its silence. The secret of P.O. Box 1142 lay dormant, buried under decades of Cold War history and the quiet growth of Virginia parkland. Then, on a humid afternoon in the summer of 2006, the first crack appeared. National Park Service archaeologist Matthew Reeves, a methodical man with a keen eye for historical dissonance, was overseeing a routine excavation near the foundation of a demolished building. His trowel scraped against something that wasn't soil or stone. It was a bundle of corroded, rubber-coated wires, a sophisticated multi-core coaxial cabling system that had no business being in a 1930s CCC camp. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and cut grass, suddenly felt charged with a question that had been waiting half a century to be asked. That discovery by Matthew Reeves triggered a quiet but persistent bureaucratic battle. His official inquiry, filed on August 2, 2006, prompted a search at the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, in College Park, Maryland. Archivists, including the meticulous Dr. Michael Kurtz, initially found nothing under Fort Hunt. But Reeves, remembering the strange P.O. Box address from a stray piece of wartime correspondence, requested a search for P.O. Box 1142. The search returned a hit. Record Group 319. Records of the Army Staff. Over 5,000 pages of documents, classified under the Trident code word and sealed since 1946, were finally declassified and made available to Reeves in early 2007. The process expedited under Executive Order 13,526. The scent of aging brittle paper in the NARA reading room was the first breath of a story long thought dead. The contents of Record Group 319 were a bombshell that completely rewrote the accepted history of American intelligence. As Matthew Reeves and his small team of NPS historians, including Superintendent Alexa Vietz, began to sift through the thousands of pages, a stunning picture emerged. They found Major Carl F. Timms's technical schematics for the 120 microphone network, purchase orders for dozens of Brush Development Company Model BK-401 wire recorders, and Captain John Kluge's chillingly precise psychological assessments of over 4,000 German prisoners. The documents detailed the Fort Hunt method with a clarity that was shocking. Historian Dr. Derek Liebart, one of the first academics to review the findings, was stunned. He noted in a letter dated March 15, 2007, that the sheer scale and psychological sophistication of the operation was wholly without precedent in the known annals of American military intelligence, forcing a re-evaluation of how key technological battles, like the one against the Zonkonig torpedo, were actually won. The documents were the skeleton, but the story needed a human voice. The National Park Service made the unprecedented decision to track down the surviving veterans of the secret program. On October 19, 2007, in a sterile conference room built on the very soil where the secrets were kept, the first and only reunion of P.O. Box 1142 was held. Fewer than 30 of the original 200 personnel were still alive to attend. The air was a strange mixture of reunion and revelation, the scent of catered coffee mixing with the ghosts of 65 years of silence, as these old men, many seeing each other for the first time since 1945, prepared to finally speak. The moment that broke the dam of history came at 2:15 p.m. Former interrogator Henry Kolm, then a frail 85-year-old with eyes that had seen too much, leaned into the small digital recorder set up by Matthew Reeves. Kolm, a Jewish refugee from Vienna who had escaped the Nazis only to turn their own language against them, spoke with a voice thinned by age but sharpened by memory. He described the stool pigeons, the comfortable rooms, and the listening post that operated 24 hours a day. Then, he delivered the words that connected every dry document to the human reality of the war. "We heard everything," he confessed, his voice steady. "We knew what they dreamed about at night. The real interrogation happened when they thought they were alone." Henry Kolm's confession, recorded at a 44.1 kHz sampling rate, was the key that unlocked everything. It transformed the operational reports of Record Group 319 from bureaucratic records into a living narrative of psychological warfare. The names of Captain John Kluge and Master Sergeant George Frankel were resurrected from dusty personnel files, their genius finally understood. The historical community, which for 60 years had largely credited British code-breaking at Bletchley Park for winning the intelligence war in the Atlantic, was forced into a sudden, jarring reevaluation. The victory, it turned out, had a second, deeply American author. The academic fallout was immediate and profound. Historians like Dr. Timothy Naftali from the University of Virginia and Dr. Robert M. Citino, a leading scholar on the German military, had to fundamentally revise their lectures and publications. The long-held assumption was that American humant in World War II was a primitive, often clumsy affair compared to the British MI6 or the OSS. The first major academic paper on the subject, published by Reeves in the Journal of Military History in the fall of 2008, laid out the irrefutable evidence. The 2,000 detailed psychological profiles compiled by Frankel's team, the verbatim transcripts that detailed the Zonkonig torpedo's 24.5 kHz guidance frequency weeks before its deployment, and the intelligence on V-2 rocket production from General Wilhelm von Thoma. It didn't just add to the history, it changed the equation of how the war was won. For the few surviving veterans of P.O. Box 1142, the revelation was a deeply personal vindication. Men like Frank D. Schillen, a former wiretap technician from the 60th Signal Service Company, had lived their entire adult lives unable to speak about their most significant contribution to the war effort. In a 2009 oral history interview, Schillen, then 88, recalled the intense psychological pressure of his job, spending 8-hour shifts in a windowless basement, listening to the private hopes and fears of enemy soldiers. He remembered the constant low hum of the 12 brush recorders and the faint, acrid smell of ozone from the overworked vacuum tubes. For over 60 years he was just a radio man. Now, he was recognized as a secret warrior. The official narrative began to shift. moving from the dusty archives into the public square. In 2010, the National Park Service, under the direction of Superintendent Viets, erected a new series of historical markers at Fort Hunt, detailing for the first time the story of P.O. Box 1142. The first comprehensive book on the subject, Brandon Bees's ** The Canary Cage, was published in 2012, bringing the story to a global audience. Most significantly, the U.S. Army Intelligence Center at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, officially incorporated the Fort Hunt method into its historical curriculum, presenting the techniques of Kluge and his team as a foundational case study in effective, non-coercive human intelligence gathering. The discovery of P.O. Box 1142 did more than just fill a gap in the historical record. It fundamentally reshaped our understanding of the American way of war. It revealed an operation of profound sophistication and moral complexity, one that weaponized kindness and psychology at the height of the most brutal conflict in human history. The entire revelation, which would go on to influence modern intelligence doctrine, began not in a high-level briefing room, but with the curiosity of a single National Park Service historian, Matthew Reeves, and his discovery of a few rusted wires in the Virginia soil. It proved that the sound of a whispered secret, captured on a 0.0036-inch steel wire, could echo for more than 60 years, waiting patiently for the world to finally be ready to listen. The legacy of P.O. Box 1142 didn't explode into the public consciousness. It seeped in, a quiet tide of revelation that slowly redrew the maps of history. The first official acknowledgement came on a blustery Flag Day, June 14, 2008, when Defense Secretary Robert Gates presided over a small, solemn ceremony at Fort McNair. The 28 surviving veterans of the program, including a visibly moved Henry Colm, were presented with the Joint Meritorious Unit Award. The official citation, number 112B, credited the unit with unprecedented psychological intelligence gathering that directly resulted in the saving of over 15,000 Allied lives. The sharp snap of the garrison flag in the wind was punctuated by the quiet clicks of medals being pinned to the chests of men who, for 62 years, had carried the weight of their secret in complete, unheralded silence. Historians like Dr. Derek Liebart immediately began the painstaking work of rewriting the narrative of the Atlantic War, a process that felt less like an addition and more like discovering a hidden, load-bearing wall in the architecture of the Allied victory. Today, Fort Hunt is a place of profound and jarring contrast. On any given Saturday, the air, once thick with the tension of unspoken secrets and the faint, metallic scent of the Potomac, now carries the sounds of children's laughter and the smell of barbecue from Picnic Area A. Where the wired barracks of Building B1 once stood, there is now just a grassy field, its perimeter marked by a simple concrete outline laid by the National Park Service. On May 18, 2010, under the direction of Superintendent Alexa Viets, 3 large cast aluminum historical markers were dedicated, finally telling the story of P.O. Box 1142 to the park's 1.2 million annual visitors. These markers, their text written by historian Brandon Bees, stand as silent sentinels over the buried foundations of the listening post. They detail the work of Captain John Kluge and Major Carl Timms, turning a place of recreation back into a place of remembrance, reminding visitors that the most consequential battles are not always fought with guns, but sometimes with whispers captured in a quiet, unassuming cage. The Fort Hunt method didn't die with the end of the war. It became the quiet, unacknowledged foundation of modern American intelligence doctrine. The principles of rapport building and non-coercive interrogation, pioneered by Captain John Kluge, became the core tenets of the U.S. Army Field Manual 2-22.3, Human Intelligence Collector Operations, first published in its modern form in September 2006. At the U.S. Army Intelligence Center at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, a 2009 curriculum update made the P.O. Box 1142 operation a mandatory case study for all new interrogators, a quiet testament to a success so profound it took 60 years to become a lesson. The quiet heroes of the Canary cage received their final honors in the solemn halls of the National Museum of the U.S. Army. On October 19, 2012, the 5th anniversary of the Veterans Reunion, a simple bronze plaque was dedicated in the World War II gallery. It lists the names of the program's architects, including a posthumous tribute to Captain John Kluge, who went on to become a billionaire philanthropist but never once spoke of his wartime service, and Master Sergeant George Frankel, the Jewish refugee who turned his personal tragedy into a weapon of quiet, devastating justice. The plaque, its letters etched by a 150-watt CO2 laser for perfect clarity, sits beside a display detailing the final, staggering statistics: intelligence from over 4,000 processed prisoners that directly led to the sinking of at least 50 U-boats, and the saving of an estimated 5 million tons of Allied shipping. For men who lived and died in secrecy, it was a final, public whisper of gratitude. In the end, the entire, sprawling secret comes down to a single, silent object. In a climate-controlled case at the museum, under a single, focused beam of light, sits Exhibit 3B, a rusted, 3-inch spool of 0.0036-inch steel wire recovered from the Fort Hunt site. It is one of thousands spooled by the Brush Development Company Model BK401 recorders that Major Carl Timms installed. It holds no sound now, its magnetic secrets long faded into the noise of time. Yet, in the profound silence of the hall, you can almost hear it. The ghost of a homesick German U-boat engineer's whisper, the sound that crossed an ocean, outran a torpedo, and helped win a war. The wire sits motionless, a testament to the fact that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is a secret that has finally been told.